In progress.
Good morning, my dear student. Today we will talk about an important part of your thesis when you're going to write as a part of the research method. Research writing, it's your thesis, an even paper, but most commonly we want to just focus on the highlight the important point that you need to consider when you write your method chapters as a part of your thesis. The method chapter represents a very important part of the entire thesis documentations, because it is one of the reasons when I said it is important, because it might focuses on the examiners or the referee criticisms. The examiners, when they read your thesis and when they reach out your an important methodology part, they may sometimes criticize or even sometimes reject the way that you present your methodology, and it's not in a professional or the scientific way. This is because it should include all the steps you followed in conducting your studies and the materials you use at each steps. Also, it is important not only for the examiners and the referees, and also sometimes it's important for the reader themselves, because they want to know the conditions that affecting your results, or for others who want to replicate or extend your study. And this is a very important point, specifically when the reader have an interest on certain subjects or topics that are very close to yours, and they need to understand exactly the steps that you follow, and they might replicate them to their thesis with simple modifications. So you need to be very clear and precise when you describe your steps of the methodology steps, including the testing methods and the materials included, and all the parts that affect the methodology that we're going to describe in a few minutes later. The method chapter in a thesis should include more details about working procedures, materials, methods of testings, and analysis than that in a paper for publications. Sometimes it seems for the thesis on the paper so similar in certain parts of your methodology, with exceptions that in your thesis you need to expand a little bit more, with more clarifications and more details about the test used on the other compartments. It should be presented, overall should be presented in a simple, precise, and clear way to make it brief and obvious for the reader. So this lecture mainly going to be focused on the writing method chapter in a thesis rather than the method described in a paper. However, similar guidelines sometimes could be followed in both, but with less details regarding journal papers. Regarding the contents of the method chapter is mainly descriptive. When we say the descriptives, it means the descriptions of everything you did while working in your research, regarding the methodology, about all procedures, maybe a material employed at each steps of the work, and could consist of the following. Starting with the overview, there's sometimes a general statements, and the length of this statement depends on your topics and depends on sometimes even the preference of the author. You are the main author of your thesis, of course. You need maybe some kind of corrections and modifications and writing corrections from your supervisor sometimes. But as a main authors, you need to, first of all, when you start, to generally describe, or just writing a general statements about the study type, the comparison that has been made, or ethical approval that has been followed. For example, according to those references that belong to those boxes, this format seems so familiar to the most of you when you read any kind of paper, and even for the thesis. It states like a general statement. For example, this study was approved by ethics committee of certain university of hospital kind, etc. And then you just describe for the total number of the subjects or the of your group involved. Descriptions about the type of the samples, for example, if it is like, for example, cross-sectional, controlled, longitudinal, for this for randomized, for example, double mask, parallel group trial. The details of each group sometimes can be listed and can be maintained within that part of the, as it is examples here in that box. For example, even the approval of the ethical committee. What, for example, this group was approved by the Office of the Human Research Ethics, and etc. So the general statement before going to the divide your sections, methodology section to the subsections and subtitles, you need to read sometimes to write a general statements, an overview looking when the readers want to start reading your methodology at overview, he just realized that, or she realized that this represents an overview, generalized overview. And again, I just repeat that this overview depends on your topic, how much you want to write, but in generally speaking, it's not be shouldn't include too much details as an overview, because from the title it is just overview. So you need to be strict on the meaning of that overview. Just little bit little sentences you need to write before going to the details. As a sample description, this could be it's very important to the most of the readers, and even for something for the publications. For the reviewers, you need to mention what the type of the samples, whether those belong to the human, animal, material sometimes, etc. This section should include a full description about the sample type. Remember those important informations: sample type, number, restriction, which means the criteria involved in defining those sample, exclusion criteria if present, or any other characteristics. For example, this box, if I just want to read it very quickly, represented four colors color coded here as a red, yellow, green, and blue. The red one represents the sample, maybe include the number of sample, the sample restriction, the criteria of those sample, the sample description. Sometimes we need to describe them, and also the excluded one for the which is sometimes if you write the inclusions, it doesn't mean necessarily you should include the exclusion one, and the vice versa. For example, this box, the Taiwan University of Hospital, Taipei, Taiwan, a total of 65 teeth with 68 vertically fractured roots from 58 Chinese patients were collected. So till now, we just described the number of the teeth involved in the study with those Chinese patients that enrolled in the study. So this represents overall the overall description of the sample, okay, between 2006 and 2016 at the National Taiwan University Hospital Thunder Department. The selected teeth with the VRF, all of the following sentence till the end of the yellow one represent the sample restriction, which include the inclusion criterion. The selected teeth with the VRF were confirmed on the basis of at least one of the following diagnostic methods: clinical examination, radiographical image, etc. Represent the types of radiograph, exploratory flap surgery, and after tooth extraction. So the author tried to explain the main things that included in the samples with the kinds of types of radiographs and the kind of surgery involved, and all the circumstances related to it. Then the red one represents the sample description. He said that a clear VRF line must either be visible or detected through one of the diagnostic method. So just describe all of those inclusion criteria and within the sample with the description of this sample restriction. Then the last line represents the exclusion one. He said that the cracked or split teeth with insufficient information for precise diagnosis and incomplete clinical or radiographical data were excluded. Okay, so this paragraph overall, when we look at it, It represents four different main things related to the description of the samples. Overall, numbering and description and exclusion. Another example, for example, this one, the definition of those samples regarding, for example, for aging, healthy men and women aged 18 to 60 years old. And then restriction, experiencing moderate to severe pain, defined as those pain according to those criteria, diagnosed with symptomatic irreversible pulpitis. Then he just started to describe the sample itself, defined as a spontaneous pain, this irreversible pulpitis, as spontaneous pain and lingering response to thermal stimuli, defined as a sensitive to percussion. Were recruited at the study. Recruited belong to those healthy men and women that the author start with. Then all the following sentences belong to the exclusion sample, but here for this example, the authors try to maybe expand a little bit about the exclusion, because he involved generally the exclusion criteria as much as he thought that is going to describe those samples. Subjects who had recently used any type of analgesics, were questions about the dose and the type of analgesic used. If it was determined that the potential study subject could be experiencing the therapeutic effect of the drug at the time of the study, they were excluded. And then, subject with a known hypersensitivity to NSAID, a history of gastric or duodenal ulcer, or they have gastrointestinal bleeding, were not recruited. So this is the meaning of exclusion also. We also excluded pregnancy. So all of these three different sentences belong to the exclusion criteria. Pregnant and lactating women and subjects classified as American Society of Anesthesiologists, class 3. Although there's some typical error here, they shouldn't use the present voice as a we also. They should use the past passive tense voice that we're going to talk about at the last part of our presentation today. Regarding the sample and grouping, this section should include the criteria determined in sample grouping, the meaning of the groupings that we mean, the method of grouping, whether those non-randomized or randomized, for example, the number of subgroups, if they have subgroups, and number of samples, represent the sample size, the full description of the sample size, how you calculate the sample size. If it is contained a formula, a certain formula, you have to mention that formula in your description as a sample size in each group, whether subgroup. You could use letter N equal as abbreviation of the numbering, sample number. Sometimes a figure can also help in this condition. So in this following box, the authors stated that 120 NITI rotary independent files were used for each of the three experimental file group, and then their subgroup, the EF, the Eagle file, or the Vortex Blue file, and the ESX file. So those grouping, the major grouping, and if they have the subgrouping also. The other example here, for example, male Worcester rats of different ages, 0 day, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 9, 12, and 24 weeks. Okay, the numbering, describing the numbering for example, 5 to 6 in each one. So they have too many groups, and for each one they describe the total number, the numbering of each groups around that average. Okay, were included in that study. So everything related to the sample grouping, the main groups, the subgroups, the numbers, description of the sample size, everything also should be clarified clearly within the sample grouping, and specifically without any kind of abbreviation or summarization. They should be, as part of your thesis writing, it should be clearly stated and written in a very clear way, rather than the sometimes the paper, you could summarize it in a different format, depending on the journal guideline or etc. The procedure, full description of the procedures, because as I said before, that many of researchers try to replicate your works, so they need to understand in details every step that you did in full descriptions and without any kind of vague imagination. This may include all procedures that have been employed during the work in all details, such as experimental work, data collection, specification of material, manufacturer recommendations, if they have certain kind of instruction, method of standardization. How can you how do you do standardization? If there's any kind of questionnaire form, you have to fully describe this questionnaire form, the software descriptions, any kind of, including the materials and equipments, any kind of test, and including within that procedures, you need to describe it according to the your chronologically using during your methodology. A flowchart for sometimes and figures can be also introduced to simplify the procedure if required, as in this example, for example. Okay, the division of those patients to the controlled or the severe symptoms, they have symptoms, and with the severe sometimes how they divided in subdivisions in each group, and etc. So you can do whatever you want, but should be very clearly, logically sequenced and have a certain flow, kind of very clear following the steps, each one from the beginning to the end steps. The sample grouping could be written, depends on your the time of the sample group. The timing could be written before or after the procedure. Okay, the time depending on the time of the sample grouping before or after experimental work. And this could be clearly clarified in certain diagrams. You could put as even sometimes as a part of the legendary explanations. So you sometimes you write that as a text in the subheading within the methodology part, but when you describe it as a figure, sometimes you could be briefly explain that, or just repeat that what you wrote in the methodology as part of the legendary part. Sometimes you summarize it in a different format. It's going to be so helpful to the most of the reader. The testing method. Regarding the testing, this may include all testing procedure with all details, such as the method of testings, which method you use for testing that material or whatever your topic depends on. The sample manipulation during testing, the testing error sometimes, and exclusion included within the testing. Methodology could be also divided into different sections according to the testing method sometimes, and each could include different experimental procedures. So this page, I think it is familiar to the most of you when anyone can read the paper. You just recognize this subheading within the methodology part and testings. For example, the ELISA analysis, or it depends on your topic actually, on the testing used to justify your what you claim about. So using certain kinds of devices or equipments, or the laboratory procedures, etc. The isolations, the essay, any different kind of essay, you can describe it according to the what the main parts of your topic are related about. So this is sometimes we call the chronologically listing of the subheading. The chronologically mean the sequence that you did exactly. For example, if you deal with the bacteria and if you deal with the cells, which one was done before the other one. So you have to describe it exactly as you stand in the laboratory and you did this step before this step and this step before this step. So this is the following, the fluence of this testing procedures. You have to write exactly what you did as a part of the written text within the methodology one. The statistical analysis, this is very important. This is represent almost at the end of section of the methodology chapter. It should include all the statistics used in the analyzing data between different groups of the study. The level of significance determined in the statistical test, the p-value, and the software used for the purpose. There are two different software used for the statistical, maybe the most conventional, the most popular one, the SPSS, but there are different kind of software used. For example, the graph path prisms seems very useful and simplified, and etc. So the whole description of the statistical, as clarified here in that box, this is an example you could follow, and you could use it in your thesis or even your paper to describe one. I just want to read very quickly this dot box just to highlight what the author mainly focused on the statistical analysis about. The statistical analysis of data obtained in the study were performed using the SPSS, the version of that software, and the company producing that software. This is very important. Using the Shapiro, for example, the Shapiro-Wilk test, which is a type of the test for the whether parametric or non-parametric, your data about, it was determined that the obtained data did not show it's a normal distribution. The normality of distribution is very important for the Shapiro one. The differences between the groups were determined using the Kruskal-Wallis and the post-hoc Dunn test. Okay, the level of statistical significance was set to 5%. So the author mentioned the main things that the reader want to know or they want to understand the statistical of that research about what. The kind of software producing, the normality, the test, the main test that measure the differences between different grouping and the level of statistical significance, because here for this example, it seems about the non-parametric one, and the level of statistical significance also he determined is about the set to 5%. So this is the main things that without being talking further more details about it, the reader mostly want to focus on just to know these parts of the statistical analysis. There's certain list of material and tools, equipments that you use it according to the guideline of different universities or different, if you're going to publish in a paper, to the guideline of the, you have to follow the guideline of those journals or as the thesis of your university. For example, in our university, according to the regulation of those thesis writing, the list of all materials, tool, equipment, or sometimes the software for analysis should be included at the beginning of each method chapter. So when you start the methodology part, you have to list all the materials, equipment, tools that included in our study. This should be checked in each department. This is again different, can be differently explained in each department according to their specific regulations. The list can be divided into different groups according to the type of the list. Whether those material, tools, equipment, etc. It is preferable that each group should be sorted in an alphabetical style to be easily followed by the readers exactly. And the identification information should be included for each item. For example, if the item is a material, you could include a full name of that material, abbreviation at the beginning may be used, company name, the country of manufacturing, the expiry date, and the catalog number or the serial number. All of them should be clearly mentioned and clarified, written to you as a part of your methodology, and should be clearly explained and clarified to the reader. When we talk about the language and the style convention, dear student, this important, it seems just about the language. It's not fundamentals, or it's not considered as a principal part of your methodology writing. But for me, I just consider this is very important. And I think one of the reasons that some of it, even for publication in the paper, publication of paper sometimes for the reason that the main reviewers or even the editor not convinced about the language that you did. Sometimes even your work is qualified for publication, but if the language is not good enough to be accepted, sometimes even believe me, can be rejected by the reviewers, specifically the editor. For that reason, so to be very precise and concise when you talk about your methodology and at which language. I'm now going to show the correct language that you need to write or to talk about when you write your thesis and even in publication. The verb tense. The verb tense is very important in the method description. Describing the method of a study, the correct verb tense normally should be a simple past tense. The simple past tense. If a sentence included within the method chapter in another verb tense, this may refer to other procedure that is not included within the study being reported. Okay. Sometimes the author or you mention different kind of tense, not simple past tense, maybe the present tense, but this is not about your work. Sometimes with different kind of procedures might include it or might be related to your study. Otherwise, the later sentences may describe a standard procedure cited within your study. So if you mention something, some procedures that belong to other study, and you cited that, that sentence as a reference, you could use a different verb tense, like for example a present one. But when you talk about your own genuine work, you have to write in a simple past tense. Okay. Choosing the passive verb tense in reporting the procedure. The use of passive tense allow the writer to omit the agent I and we. Unfortunately, sometimes I just reported that in the thesis or even a paper publication, when the author try to explain about the agent description, which mean the agent, which mean the author themselves. They just try to say I found it that blah blah blah, or we discovered that the agent, etc. This is not accepted when you as an official language or an academic language when you write the your methodology, and even specifically on the methodology, and even sometimes in the discussion or in the result, and emphasize on the procedure and how it was done. Okay. This is the general formula that the authors, it seems it's going to be logically for the authors when he or she try to write the sentence. For example, the agent plus the main verb, which is the active one, plus the object, okay, and then the complement the rest of the sentence. For example, this example, we represent the agent, we applied the main verb and the stress, which is the object, to the rubber segments in a gradual increasing increments, like a complement or the rest of the sentence. The correct sentence should be written, as we said, in the simple past passive voice. Okay, so this passive voice include the subject should be, or the object should be coming in the first of the sentence, followed by the verb in the middle, and then the agent. So instead of saying we applied stress, this could be modified as the stress was applied. The stress was applied, the object first, and then applied, was applied, okay, because it is past passive, was applied, and then the agent instead of we, which is kind of by the investigators, for example, it can be replaced. So the stress was applied by an investigator to the rest of the complement sentence or the complement one. So here we just a little bit change the sentence. We reverse the object instead of agent and vice versa to make it instead of the active voice to be in the passive voice. Using short passive tenses in procedural descriptions. In an academic and technical English, a tendency to simplify certain kinds of passive construction, okay, by shortened sentences. Sometimes instead of seeing even in a passive voice, when you have a very long sentence, you could be shortened that or could be summarize it, but according to an academic English style. Okay, there are three commonly used kind of passive sentences in procedural descriptions. Any one of them will represent the correct one and right one, but it depends on your preference and depends on the style of that sentence within that paragraph. Number one, the first compound sentence. When we say compound sentence, it means that the sentence have more than one subject, or even sometimes more than one past principles. So the first compound sentence with two subjects and two or more verbs and passive tense. Okay. In this case, to shorten this type, you have to omit the second subject and the related be verb in the second part of the sentence. For example, the general formula of that rule as this one: subject one plus be the verb be, and then the past participle one, then the conjunction, and then subject to plus verb be, and then the past participle two. As this sentence, the data, for example, the data subject one were represent verb be collected as a past participle one here. Then the conjunction, for example, and the subject one, they, okay, they belong to the data, okay, because it just repeated because there's a conjunction, okay. They were verb be and then past participle two. So here we have two past participles, okay, and two subjects. It seems the same subject, but it just repeated it twice. So the sentence could be read as this one: the data were collected and they were analyzed. It seems a bit longy, and it's not like read and pronounced correctly and very well, and should be written in a summarized and an abbreviated form. So here, according to that rules, we could omit the subject one, they, and then the verb be. So instead of that, the data were collected and analyzed. You don't have to repeat the subject one and verb be again. So it seems it gives you the same meaning, but in a very abbreviated and summarized form. So the data were collected and analyzed instead of saying the data were collected and they were analyzed. Okay, this is represent the first commonly used kind of the passive sentences in the procedural description. The second one, the compound sentence is composed from two different subjects, and two different verbs in the passive voice. So there's subject one and subject two, and the past participle one and the past participle two here. To shorten this type, only omit the second auxiliary verb be. Just the verb be here should be excluded, that coming before the second verb. So for this example, the data were collected and correlations, which represent the second subjects, were calculated. So according to that rule, we need just to omit the verb be here. The where should be excluded. So instead of that sentence, it should be written in this way: the data were collected and correlation calculated. Okay. Also, maybe some of you consider that this is not going to make a big deal or the big difference between the second one and this first one, but as a part of the grammatical English academic English style, it is accepted and adapted even in English writing. So in the as a part of the methodology, because those sentences you're going to find you will use it a lot to describe your methodology part. The third one, the third compound sentence has a which clause, okay, which has a conjunction with a passive verb tense in the first part of the sentence. This could be shortened by dropping the conjunction which and the auxiliary verb be. So here we have a subject plus conjunction, then verb be, and then past participle one, then the verb, and the complement the rest of the sentence. So here we have the example here: the data which were obtained, were subjected to an analysis of variance. So here we need to omit the conjunction on verb be, which and where. So the data, instead of saying which were, the data obtained directly, the data obtained were subjected to analysis of variance. Okay, or you could change the first passive verb into an adjective before the subject. The obtained data, instead of saying that, the obtained data were subjected to an analysis of variance, which is acceptable too. So either of those two sentences could be used when you write and describe your data as and a third examples of using a passive voice. When you about recording your events chronologically, I just talked about in a minute before that the method should be done in a list-like style. Okay, you have to be strict in the timing of each event, exactly as just give an imagination to the reader that he just imagining and understanding exactly each one you did it before the other one. Okay, this could be done in different way. Either you just put it like, for example, X was done before Y, or was done after X, okay, or X was done, comma, then using the word then, Y was done, or X was done, dot, on the as a new sentence, Y was done, which as in a two separate sentences. So for the first one, I'm going to give you the green color. When I said X was done before Y or Y after X, the blue one referred to the X was done then Y, or red one referred to the X was done dot Y was done. Okay, for this box example, you can see the 10 male Worcester rats, 12 to 13 week age, 400 to 500 gram weight, were killed in a CO2 chamber. Half mandibles equal to 20 were dissected and sectioned and divided incisor into apical, middle, and incisal pieces. This represents the last example, which I give the red color coded, like X was done, dot, Y was done. The X was done here, the first sentence is the 10 mil to the CO2 chamber. Y was done, started from the half mandibles were dissected on them. So the author tried to mention that in two different sentences as a part of the giving or describing the Worcester rats and how they were killed, on how the mandibles dissected, and etc. So this is acceptable, completely acceptable, and is adapted in the methodology part in the paper and even in thesis. The second one, with high-speed diamond burrs under constant water cooling before fixation in 400 paraform, which represent the green one here. X was done before Y. So he mentioned that the high-speed diamond burr under constant water cooling before fixation in 400 paraformaldehyde and phosphate buffer saline for 24 hours at 4 centigrade. Samples were demineralized and prepared in frozen blocks. So the patient, the authors here mentioned that certain steps he did it before the other one, which is very clearly using the letter, the word before. Also, you can just reversibly or reverse the sentence when you say fixation done after the high-speed burns under constant water cooling, which is also acceptable. And the last one, the blue one, when he said X was done, comma, then Y was done. So here, in the frozen blocks as a trace buffer saline for 10 minutes each, Shield hard set mounting medium with DAPI was then applied. Here you can see X, then Y was done. Okay, so here was then applied before. So when he said then applied before, he mean X1, okay, before the Y1, before placing that to placing a cover slip for the immunohistochemistry examination, of course. So he mentioned something before that, but before mentioned word before using then, which is sometimes accepted. This depends on using which one is correct according to your preference. It depends on your styles, and depends on your text, on the main topics, and how can you divide your description in which parts. But generally, any one of them represents one examples of the chronologically recorded events of your methodology, which is accepted. You need also to define all terms in your writing and be more precise. For example, when you say high X or delayed X, prolonged X, try to make it more clarified by saying how high. What's the meaning of high? What's the meaning of delayed or long or prolonged? This is one more, just one word description is sometimes not enough and may give a vague description to the reader. So the readers need to understand the details about that high or delay or prolonged. Try to avoid numbering groups or labeling them with letters. Always use descriptive labels instead. Instead of saying a group A and B, okay, you can name that group A and B in different ones, like for example, cavity and non-cavity groups, something. And you can do abbreviation for these names to be much more convenient. Okay, the cavity you can abbreviate it, or non-cavity you can abbreviate it, but don't just sticks on the letters, group 1, group 2, group A, group B. This is not scientifically accepted to the most of the papers and even the thesis, more specifically. Explain in details all randomization. If your topics about using any kind of randomizations, you need to write much more details about randomization procedures. For example, if there's sealed enveloped randomization technique or the computer program technique, etc. Okay, how you did exactly the randomizations, not just sticks about one or two words. You have to, in sentences, describe the details of that randomization to make it clear to the readers. Describe controls thoroughly, similar to the test groups population. Unfortunately, we found that most of the students try to focus only on the test group because it is represent the newly discovered or the newly researched group that they want to show to the main of the to the reviewers, and either write a little bit about the control one, or even sometimes ignore the control. So it depends on your departments, but on your supervisors, of course, opinion. But the definition of those control sometimes even most important when you compare as a control whether positive or negative to the test one. So try to justify your claims and randomization. How did you find or select and match control? Definition of control. Positive, negative control sometimes required to add more justification. In terms of justification, it's an important, of course. Be very precise in describing samples. How many screened and how many excluded samples? If there's any kind of dropping that sample, this is sometimes you can find it within the methodology as part of the flowable chart when at the starting point to the end point. How can the samples are dropped or lost for specifically for the follow-up, and if they are dropped or lost, why? Are they deceased? Are they died? What's happened to them? Okay. If they excluded, why they excluded according? Of course, you need to describe their exclusion on inclusion criteria before, but as a graph or as a flow chart, you need to mention that in the boxes exactly what's the meaning of those excluded and included. Okay, so this is very important in describing samples. You have to remember. Define any blinding technique. If you use a blinding, if it's about a clinical trial specifically, those type of study, is it single blind, double blinded, if those double blinded, parallel or crossover. If you use a sometimes triple blinded, okay, just to avoid the kind of bias that might affecting your expected outcome. So you need to mention those kind of blindness in your methodology if your topic's about the clinical trial specifically. Avoid repeating quantities. Unfortunately, for a lot of the students, just repeating, specifically also related to the number. Okay, for adults, for example, omit if you're describing the ages in years or years old. Try to omit those years old every time when you are talking about ages. So, for example, here the respondents were aged 40 to 60. Don't say that it's 40 years to 60 years, okay, or years old. So ages were between 40 to 60. This is accepted and enough. However, you need to mention time period. If your enrollment of a study between certain time to a certain time, you have to mention exactly whether in months or years. That different different times. So children enrolled were from 14 months, okay, to 5 years old. This one is accepted of age. Follow-up, for example, time ranging from 6 months to 2 years. This is accepted. But just describing the ages of those patients or the samples involved, stick with that number alone is accepted. I'm just, this is the references. You can follow all of these textbooks on textbooks and academic textbooks regarding the methodology part, which seems very useful just to explain your knowledge and information about the methodology writing. On this methodology writing, as I said, I just want to highlight the main things that you need to remember when describing the methodology on writing. With all my wishes and best wishes for all of you to be very precise, concise with your sentences and paragraphs, and you write in a very good way on a professional as a researchers, whether a master student or PhD one, and even for diploma students, you need to be strict for those main points. And of course, there are certain guidelines according to the university. If you're going to publish in a paper, you have to stick with the guideline of those journals. But overall, these points or these slides that I mentioned, I think it just real summarize the main things that you need to consider when you're writing the methodology part. So appreciate for your kind attention, and thank you so much for your listening. And I will be so happy if any one of you have any kind of questions. You can come in person in the department, on my departments, in the periodontics department, just explain everything that you don't understand regarding this presentation. Thank you so much, and wishing you a very good luck. Bye-bye.